Hi, we're Group 38 and our study is titled Climate Change Perceptions in International Media. While climate change is a global issue requiring global solutions, how it is experienced varies widely across the globe. How climate change events are interpreted and acted on by the public are impacted by several issues, including the level of personal, corporate, or governmental responsibility assumed, the media landscape, and cultural norms. In some countries, such as the US, misperception is widespread and many do not believe that climate change is caused by human activity, whereas in Europe, where I am in Ireland, the media coverage might be much more balanced. Misperception can undermine the public support needed to enact climate change policy, and biased news media has been shown to affect political outcomes. Our group members are from all over the world. We have Lyndon in California, Sonrisa in Georgia, US, Kyung Mi in South Korea, Mia in the UK, and myself recently returned from Australia. Through our experience as an international group, we decided to explore case studies of how the media had impacted on public perceptions of climate change and how that had helped or hindered climate action. Our methodology was fairly simple. First of all, we each chose a climate event that we had personally lived through, one that we could comment on, what it was like, and also how the media covered that and what the public perception was. We each chose 4 news sources that were relevant to that climate event, be it national news, local news, or state-based news. We chose 4 news stories per source, and then after having a look at the headlines and the content of those news stories, we categorised the way the climate event was reported, who was reported to be to blame, and what action should be taken as suggested by that news source. And after doing all that research, we sort of categorised the responses and sought to comment on any patterns that we could see in the way that the media is reporting climate events and what action should be taken.
My name is Lyndon, and I'm from the state of California. I've chosen to focus on the 2018 Camp Wildfire, the deadliest and most devastating in Californian history. It is well established that climate change has contributed to the increase in frequency and severity of wildfires in the state. The 4 newspapers with the highest readership in California are listed here. 2 have a left-leaning political bias, while the other 2 are considered center or unaffiliated. As we can see, over 3/4 of the left-leaning news articles mention climate change, directly or indirectly, compared to less than half of impartial articles. Here is a breakdown of what articles cited as factors that contributed to the wildfire, with a clear discrepancy between left-leaning and unaffiliated papers. In conclusion, we can see that left-leaning news articles were far more likely to mention climate change. Unaffiliated news articles, on the other hand, were more likely to focus only on the immediate cause of the fire, a utility line malfunction. Furthermore, left-leaning papers were willing to criticize climate denialist rhetoric and present a fuller picture, whereas one unaffiliated newspaper presented climate denialism in an impartial light, thus potentially validating it. We can thus conclude that there was a noticeable difference in how different newspapers presented the cause of this wildfire, and political bias may contribute to this.
Hi, my name is Sonrisa from the U.S. state of Georgia. In 2018, Hurricane Michael was the first Category 3 hurricane to make a direct hit on our state in more than a century. The major newspapers in my state span left center to far right. The only article I found that associated Michael with climate change was left center. In that same article, a resident was quoted as saying that weather was uncontrollable and an act of God.
Hi, my name's Rachel McGinley. I'm currently based in Ireland, but I've just moved back here after 10 years in Australia. The case study I looked at was in Queensland, and it was the coral bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef, where they had an extreme event this summer. I had a look at 3 newspapers in Queensland: The Australian, which is a national paper with a right-wing bias; The Guardian, which is an international website but has an Australian presence with a left-wing bias; and the Courier Mail, which is a local newspaper only in Queensland with a right-wing bias, but much more of a focus on local issues. I didn't really find what I expected. I was surprised to find that none of the papers specifically denied climate change. They all stated climate change as a fact, but where they differed was how they sought action. The left-wing paper sought 70%, really supported action from the government in terms of policies and programs, and it also supported action from local business. But in the right-wing media, there wasn't really any mention of policies or carbon taxes, but there was a focus on action from business, but not necessarily on global climate change, more on addressing the issue of coral bleaching in Queensland. And in conclusion, I didn't find that climate change denial was widely reported in Australia, but I did find differences between what the left wing and the right wing media said we should do about it. The left wing centre news was focused on facts and science and I felt was quite fair about how they reported things. It also focused on policy and government intervention to address climate change. The right wing news was found to be more contrarian and often proposed that solutions were unclear, unproven, or posed unreasonable costs. And it also focused on quick fixes and new technological solutions rather than addressing the root cause of climate change. There are a few news articles about things like IVF for coral reefs to sort of increase repopulation, or to look at ways to filter water, or kind of fix things at the reef rather than really addressing climate change.
I'm happy to introduce the case from South Korea. I am Youngmi, and in Korea we have had extreme climate threats as well. The event of heat waves set the new record this summer, and also they set the new record of flood and the longest period of wet season, which impacted lots of people finally this year. And all these events were highlighted and emphasized over all these national newspapers. So in Korea, every newspapers publish the articles about this extreme climate and abnormal flood and heat waves. Also, perspective on climate disaster are all mentioned well in a quite central manner. But the topic is not too much politicized in Korea. I think it's also aligned with the government policy implemented and start to take action. However, we have like very low frequency on the topics in the article about the climate change in major newspapers, and I think that's also affected to the awareness of the general audience so far. But then this year, because of this live experiences, the general audience, the awareness start to increase, and also a lot of articles start to be appeared demanding to government and corporation, such as stop investing into the fossil fuel industries.
Overall, we found a link between left or right bias and whether or not the news sources acknowledge climate change. There could be a difference in the prevalence of media bias between countries. In some countries, the discussion was going away from climate denialism to being more contrarian. We found that if causal links were identified and actions were taken or called for, they generally address the symptoms, effects of climate change rather than the root causes. Appropriate assignment of responsibility is important. According to Tim Crossland, a barrister involved in bringing a lawsuit against the government in the UK for inadequate action on climate change, the litigation's purpose is to close the accountability deficit, which is one of the biggest problems with climate change. If everybody is responsible, nobody is responsible. Blaming government may erode trust needed for effective climate legislation. Trust in government was recently identified as connected to whether or not people support a carbon tax. 90 corporations alone produced and marketed the fossil fuels and cement responsible for nearly 2/3 of the world's carbon emissions, and the industry indisputably knew the harm their products were doing to the climate while engaging in misinformation campaigns that included forged letters to Congress, secret funding of a supposedly independent scientist, the creation of fake grassroots organizations, multiple efforts to deliberately manufacture uncertainty about climate science, and that continues today. Despite this, no news sources we found linked these corporations to the damages caused by climate change. We gain comfort and security from conforming to the status quo. Human preference and behavior have been found to be determined more by perceived status quo than some deeply ingrained intrinsic motivation, and what we consume is driven by habits that can be changed. Media reference to climate change impact-related events could help align perception with reality by implicating not just humanity as the cause, but the fossil fuel industries who are ultimately responsible not just for the CO2 in the atmosphere, but for the misinformation that inhibits action to address it. Through the rise of social media, individuals are links in viral chains of information, and we have a larger share of the control of what news is spread. We can share factual rather than biased news that accurately reflects the causative factors of climate change, and do not let those with the greatest share of responsibility and the means to address the root causes of climate change, i.e. the fossil fuel industry, off the hook. If anyone is interested in collaborating on a Facebook group or something like that that aggregates media and summarizes studies that accurately portray climate change impacts and causal relationships for easy social media posting, let's organize in Slack. Thanks.